Today's topic, and it's a big one, and it's also very, very common. It is one of the top ones, right? One of the top issues.
Absolutely.
For business owners.
Dealing with financial stress. I can't imagine if you've tuned in to this topic that you're also likely experiencing, have dealt with. And I'm just kind of curious, in what ways have you dealt with financial stress, or how do you feel like that financial stress manifests in your life? I know that for myself, we were talking about this a little bit earlier about how those financial stresses, fears are there in the background. And I know that one that has been there perennially for me for a long time in earlier iterations of my business and my personal life. And it was one of these illogical kind of things that was running in the background, but things financially were going okay in the business. I wouldn't have any problem, checking the numbers, looking where things were. But if I had a sense that things were starting to go south, or if I was experiencing some kind of struggle, I couldn't bring myself to look at the numbers, to go do the checkbook. At that point, just do a simple balancing of my checkbook. And it was just one of those kind of things that the more that fear was running in the background, the more that program kicked in.
Mm-hmm.
And it was clear. I mean, it's obviously clear now to see that program that was running in the background wasn't helping me in what I was doing. So let us know if you've experienced any of those kind of things. Do you have some other type of fear or way that fear is manifesting in the background?
Yeah, it's one of the biggest challenges for business owners of all kinds. I've also had experiences, I used to not want to look at my banking. It's that thing of if you don't look, it's not there kind of thing. But I want to also just clarify. So today, what we're going to be talking about is we're going to give you some tips and things like that for overcoming this and what is going on in your brain and why it's like it is, why we fear it so, why we have this fear and the stress is so strong. But I want to make it clear, first of all, clarify that this is not about not having financial challenges in your business, because that's not a thing. So as anyone who's running a business is going to have some kind of financial challenge, because that's part of the landscape. And an analogy I thought of this morning is, it's interesting if we go hiking in the mountains. That's right. I'm not a big hiker myself, so I didn't get the terminology from it. But if we go hiking in the mountains, we're not expecting a straight paved road. We're expecting hiking in the mountains. And business is also, it's an adventure. It's the unknown. That's why not everybody does it, and not everybody is cut out for it. When we go hiking in the mountains, we're not expecting a straight road. We're not expecting to have no challenges. With business, although we consciously and intellectually may be expecting challenges, we often, when they happen, we can feel stressed,
Paralyzed,
worried, it's frozen, paralyzed, that kind of thing. So it's like going hiking in the mountains and then coming across something you have to climb over, or a river you have to cross, and feeling frightened by it. No need to be frightened. You just know, okay, I need to find a way around this. It doesn't mean anything beyond that. But in business, because the unconscious part of the brain is pumping stress chemicals into our system, we tend to look at financial challenges as something like, I'm not good enough, or just an unexplained fear. It's like there's a monster under the bed, or we're frightened that there's a monster under the bed and we don't want to look. And you need to look in order to figure it out. So the first part of this that I wanted to share is thinking of the logic of it. So right now, wherever you are in your business or financially, if there is something you can do to change those circumstances or to improve the situation, fantastic, do that. If there's action you can take, absolutely do that. If there isn't, if there's nothing you can do about it in this moment, then focusing on it and worrying about it is, of course, not going to change it. And it's putting you at a disadvantage. When we have stress chemicals in our system, which of course is included with fear and worry, the prefrontal cortex of the brain goes offline. Blood drains from that part of the brain as part of the fight, freeze, flight, which means we literally can't think straight. So that's where we do all our cognitive thinking, risk assessment, our judgment, creativity, problem solving, noticing opportunities, communication. All of that happens in that part of the brain. And while we are feeling a negative emotion, the blood drains from that part of the brain and we literally can't think straight. So worrying about your finances or the financial situation when you can't do anything about it is like sitting in a dark room and not switching on the light. It's just sitting in the dark room. It's not just about sitting in the dark. It's about that until you switch the light on, you can't find anything. You can't find what you need. The equivalent of that is focusing on the fear and worrying about your finances will mean you don't have the part of your brain online in order to get the solution, come up with the solutions and the options that you need. I wanted to make that very clear that this is a logical thing. Now, it's not easy. So the point is that the unconscious part of your brain that is creating the fear and the worry is not logical. So it's like you've got a dog that is barking because there's a noise outside. What we tend to do consciously is join in. So we feel the fear and then the conscious mind tends to, oh yeah, and it's terror and focusing on it. That's like the dog is barking at a noise and we're sitting with the dog focusing on the noise, even though there's no real danger. But the dog is very loud and the feelings are very strong. And so that's why it's difficult, because they're caused by stress chemicals like adrenaline and cortisol that are produced when our lives are in danger. So that's why it's so intense.
And when we feel the feelings of that, we feel the adrenaline and we feel the cortisol, heart rate is pumping, we got that gripping feeling in your stomach, the anxiety, however we describe that, that is difficult to ignore. I mean, it's a physical sensation. We're feeling that. Doing this work is getting at, or we're trying to be able to first answer what's going on in the moment, despite the feelings that we're feeling. Like using that example of the dog barking, it's difficult to ignore the fact that the dog is barking, and we have to use the conscious mind to be able to assess the situation. Is like, okay, there's actually nothing here in the moment that the dog is barking at. If there was, then obviously we would deal with that. But for the most part, those of us that have been puppy owners know that sometimes dogs bark and they're barking at things. We have no idea what's going on. But that propensity to, like, we're triggered by that barking noise, and our conscious mind is trying to figure out, what should I be afraid of now? We feel those neurochemicals inside. We feel our stomach tightening up. We feel our heart racing. And it's like, what should I be afraid of? And then we get on the hamster wheel of that. And then we end up creating more negative neurochemicals, and we just get into that cycle.
Yeah, absolutely. And so the first key is to, number one, recognize that that's what's happening. So when you think of your finances, when you think of the situations, the challenges you have, it's reminding yourself that what you're feeling doesn't necessarily match up with the reality. In other words, the fear that you're feeling is connected to survival. It's not connected to your finances, unless you are literally about to die because of your finances. It's a disconnect there, because the same chemicals are produced when our lives are in danger. When we feel any kind of negative emotion, it feels much more intense than it necessarily needs to be, number one. And then the second thing is to also remind yourself that just because you can't see a solution from where you are now doesn't mean there isn't one. We can't see around corners. So very often we're going through our lives and we don't think of something or notice something or come across something until we're practically on top of it. Understanding that your brain is behaving as if what you've got right now is all there ever is, and then worst case scenario. Whereas the truth is that when those chemicals shift, the stress chemicals come down, blood returns to your prefrontal cortex, you'll probably find that you think of things you hadn't thought of before. Back in 2015, I was really struggling financially, and I was cleaning other people's houses, couldn't pay my bills, really struggling. And I hated cleaning houses. So I was doing a few different things. Cleaning houses was part of that. And I hated doing it, and I would dread doing it, and I would try and make the most of it, and look forward to being finished with it. And a friend eventually said to me, how much do you get paid for cleaning houses? And at that time it was £80. I was living in England, £80 a month. And she said, and how much do you get paid for a singing gig? And it was £100, sometimes 120, 140, but I said £100. And suddenly it occurred to me, and I had never thought of that before. I only needed to do one extra singing gig a month, and I loved singing. So it was doing one extra thing that I loved per month, a 2-hour singing gig, and I could completely give up the cleaning that I hated. It had never occurred to me. Bizarrely, it had never occurred to me. And the reason I'm pointing that out is because there will be things that may be obvious to other people, solutions and options that you cannot see from where you are for two main reasons. Number one, prefrontal cortex offline, so you don't have the cognitive thinking ability that you could have when you're feeling good. And secondly, the unconscious references, that your self-image, which is a big topic that we go into in our free masterclass. The link is in the description. So my self-image and worldview back then was that I needed to be struggling, and so my brain was filtering out anything that didn't match up with struggling, keeping me in alignment with doing something I hated doing for a lot less money. When I realized that, I got one extra singing gig per month and gave up the cleaning. And I was like, I can't believe I've never done this before. So yeah, I wanted to share that example because it's an extreme one, of course, because it seems so ridiculous, but it was such an eye opener.
Yeah. And I think that starting to get an understanding of how this unconscious machinery is operating in the background, because of that self-image and worldview that has been developed throughout our life, it ends up creating a filter that we just can't see, sometimes the very obvious that's in front of us.
Right. So those two things. So first of all, recognizing that the fear, the intensity of the fear you're feeling is not necessarily a match for the reality. Now, that doesn't mean the fear will go away. It just means that it helps to start bringing your cognitive thinking online. So unless your life is in immediate danger, there's no need for the fear, really. It's not helpful. Number two, reminding yourself that just because you can't see a solution or think of a solution right now doesn't mean there isn't one. And then the third thing I wanted to point out is looking at the worst case scenario. And that can go against the grain. That can seem counterintuitive. I go, oh no, don't think about the worst case scenario because then you'll make it happen. The idea is to look at the worst case scenario for two main reasons. Number one, to bring down those stress chemicals so that you know what you'll do if that happens. You're not going to make it happen, but if it happens, you want to know what you'll do. And number two, because it's probably not what you think. And also that your brain lets it go then. So what I mean by that is, if you're frightened that there's a monster under the bed, but you don't look to check if there's a monster under the bed, if there is something under the bed, what kind of monster it is, or then you're just going to sit there frozen in fear and it keeps you stuck. On the other hand, if you think about it and you think, okay, worst case scenario, what's the worst that can happen? And this is the important piece, what will I do then? What would my options be then? So if the worst thing, the thing you're worried about, so number one, identifying what you're really worried about helps to also reduce the fear of the unknown. And then secondly, if that happens, then that. So it's like if you're doing a fire drill thing, practicing the fire drill or figuring out what you'll do if there's a fire doesn't make a fire happen, but it means that if a fire happens, you've got a plan, you know what you'll do. Now, ideally, you never have to experience that, but the point of having something, knowing what you'll do, helps your brain to let go and go, okay, so it's okay. If the bad thing happens, I know what I'll do. Now let me focus on what I really want and moving forward.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that notion of, I've spent a lot of years of my life worrying about things that never happened, or I'm really botching that quote, but oftentimes we get so focused on this monster, this worst case scenario that's running around in the back of our head. And doing that work seems completely counterintuitive. And I remember you and I working on this
Yeah.
When we were first getting started, and I had such resistance
Yes.
to, it's like, I can't allow myself to think about the worst case scenario because
Yeah.
I don't want to manifest that. I
Right.
don't want to
That's
make
right.
that
Yeah.
happen in my life. And I know that we go into this in more detail in the masterclass, but really recognizing that the monster that we're really afraid of isn't what we think it is in the moment.
Mhm.
It's not that the financial situation that we're dealing with in the moment isn't really what's causing the fear. And then really kind of diving in to figure out what is the
Mhm.
foundation or what is actually causing that fear, that monster that we're running from is really what changes all of that.
Right.
But again, if we face that fear head on
Mhm.
and figure out what it is, then it's like, oh,
Mhm.
then now I can actually deal with the situation. It's like it doesn't make the situation change,
Change one way or the other. Yeah.
but now I've got the mental capacity to be actually able to engage and come up with solutions.
Absolutely. And I've lost count of the
Mhm.
number of times where it looked like there was no other solution, or it looked like we had no options, or that kind of thing. And then, never thought of that. Something comes. In that
Mhm.
moment, what's happened is stress chemicals have come down. Feel good chemicals have been starting to be produced, and blood has returned to the cognitive thinking part of the brain. And then you see things, you think things,
Yeah.
you would contact people. There's all of that. Let us
Um,
know if there's anything that we haven't covered. If you have questions or challenges or problems that you feel like you didn't address this, and we will answer those comments.
yeah. And if this conversation has kind of sparked that curiosity of trying to figure out what it is for yourself that
Mhm.
is those underlying references or that underlying what caused the fear in the first place, because
Mhm.
everybody has a different reaction
Yeah.
to what's going on in the moment. So just because I may be experiencing situation XYZ situation in my life, in my business right now, my reaction to that is
Mhm.
completely unique to everybody else's.
Mhm.
And
Yes.
that's what we want to dive into. That's what we want to spend some time working on in order to be able to modulate that fear response
Right.
that's there.
Yeah, because not everybody has the same reaction or experience of the same circumstances and situations. So the same financial challenge with two different people, they could have completely different experiences of it and reactions and responses, and therefore come up with different solutions
Hmm.
as well.
Well, again, if you want to join in or dive in a little bit more in looking at those foundational pieces, check out that link in the description for our
Yes.
masterclass. We'd love to see you there, and we'll kind of go a little bit deeper with that.
Yes, indeed. All right. Have a fabulous rest of your day. Bye bye now.
Bye for now.